All right, everyone. Thanks for showing up. This is going to hopefully, it might be a part 2 series, maybe even a part 3 series, but I'm going to try to go in depth on nib making and the how to and the why, and try to answer anybody's questions if they have them. But first, here is one of the nibs I made. This is my personal pen, and I use a Canwright or Noodler's 308 converter, or it's not really a converter, it's more like an eyedropper converter, but I love these. And this is my personal pen, and I prefer this over the cartridge converter. But this was custom ground by Mark Bacchus, and it has a welded tipping, and it's my go-to pen every day when I sign all my work. So the materials that make up a nib are basically just the metal for the body, which we'll get into later on, the tipping, which we'll also get into later on, and the tipping is a harder surface than the metal, or a harder material than the metal. And then you need your feeds, or feed and housing, which either is made from ABS or plastic or ebonite. And we'll get into this later on too. But the combination of these three materials are what make up a fountain pen nib. Real quickly, I want to show you that the metal that I'm using, now you've seen it in the prior segment, but I'm using a material that is sold through Stuller, and it's called Continuum. It's a blend of sterling silver and palladium with a small bit of copper. You don't need a lot of palladium to add to sterling silver to give it the hardness of 14 karat gold. The reason that I chose this is because I just wanted to be unique. I wanted to offer a different experience than what you would typically get from a lot of other makers and a lot of other pen companies. This is where I begin every nib, or I begin to make my nibs. This is a jeweler's mill. And what it does is it takes thicker metal and makes it thinner metal. Also, what you need is a jeweler's thickness gauge. It has from gauge 30, from gauge 36 all the way up to 0 gauge right here, which is probably a half an inch or close to a half an inch. So basically what you do is you run your metal through this until you can get the thickness that you're looking for. And the typical thickness that I'm looking for is just about 28 gauge. Okay, that's just where I want to start. And you'll see why. So how do I get the shape for my nibs? These are all the dies that I use for my nibs. Early on, I used this style, which is almost like a circle cutter style jig that jewelers use to cut out circles and stuff, and these are in the shape of nibs. And I had these made a few years back, and I think I had them made in India. The problem is that it's difficult when I'm placing my metal to know how much metal is on one side or the other, and I just didn't really like using them because they were difficult to use. Then I reached out to Dar Shelton, who's an excellent craftsman in his own right, and he made these pancake dies for me. And the great thing about these pancake dies is that you can place your metal right in the specific location that you want to punch. And it saves material. And that's one of the big things, and it cuts very cleanly. Now, one reason that I even went further to get different ones is because these are not always perfectly symmetrical, and Dar would tell me that, I get as close as I can, and I still use these. It just takes a little bit more filing to get each side perfectly symmetrical. Then I went to a company called Bonnie Doon Tools. When all other companies told me no, he told me yes. Peter Gilroy from Bonnie Doon Tools out of Taos, New Mexico, made these perfectly symmetrical That means that both the same size are in the same shape on each side, so there's not a lot of filing, and I can go right to bending or making the nib without doing a lot of shaping. And these are excellent, and they work really well. And of course, like I said, the pancake die saves you in wasting a lot of materials. And if anybody wants to buy these from him, I have no problem with you going on his site and asking him, hey, can you make me the same set of nib pancake dies that you made for Tim Cullen? I designed this with him, this shape that I use. You can also get a design that you want to make your own nibs, and he will gladly make them. This is a jeweler's press. It's just a basic one. It's not a wazoo, really expensive one, but you don't need one for making nibs. You don't need a really expensive one. I did end up changing this. It had a cheaper one, and this is, I think, 12 ton, and it I can get a lot of force out of this. So the next process in making a nib is to cut out one of my silhouettes. So it's a real simple. You just place the material, like I said, in between the pancake die. You put it right here, and you just let it sit there. And you need an aluminum block or some type of block that goes on top. You want to place it there, not to move your metal or anything. And you just crank it out, get it to the top, and snap. Here's what you have. You have a little bit of excess here, but you have a perfect silhouette of a fountain pen nib. So what I do next is I'll take it to my jeweler's shear, and I'll just shear off what I don't need. I can file that down. Also, we're going to be taking some down from the top here. All right, here we have our nib blanks. I brought a couple out for you to see. So most commercially made nibs are tapered. They're tapered down because the nib acts as a wedge to keep that friction fit. If a nib was thickness the same all the way through and it went into the housing, it's not going to stay tight. It could, but you'll be forcing it. Basically, what you want to do is create a wedge because it goes in there really easy, and then, as any wedge does to wedge anything, it tightens as it moves in. It also helps with close tolerances. Well, the big companies have the ability to create this taper with rolling mills, which I don't, and you probably won't either. So next, I'm going to show you how I do this without costing a lot of money. Here we are at the nib making bench. So I'm going to show you my high-tech way to get this wedge effect without breaking the bank, and it's pretty simple. So let's see how thick our metal is, and I'm going to suppose it's around 36. Yep, perfect. 36 millimeters, or a little around 28 gauge. So what I want to do is I want to try to take my nib below 30. So basically what I do is I take my thumb and forefinger and I stick it on the nib and I start to sand and putting pressure at the front of the tip of the nib at the end, at the back, and I just start rubbing back and forth, and I move it over. I keep going back and forth, and basically you can see how it's creating almost a wedge effect. And I do the front part first, and this doesn't take very long, and then I start elongating my sanding. And I want to do it evenly, so I put pressure, and as you can see, it's pretty even. You can see that in the light. And now we can go back, see where we're at. We're still at, we're getting down 32 now. We're down at about 32. And I want to keep doing this until I get probably to about 30, because it gives me some room to play with, to fine tune it when I get to the point where I'm trying to fit it to my feed. All right? So next, after doing that, what I want to do is I want to file all the edges that, where I cut on my, to get them straight across and maybe round over a little bit. And also I want to take a small bit of this tip off. And the reason that I do that is because when I created this silhouette, I created it at the exact length that I wanted it when I had it tipped. So I'm going to have to remove this part where about 1.25 millimeters down, so it will be at the length that I want once I'm done. So I just measure 1.2 millimeters down, and then I just cut it off with the nippers, or you could even shear it off with the shears. Okay, so here's our blank. I've nipped off the front end. I've got it pretty close. But the next thing you want to do is you want to take a sanding stick or a sanding fid or whatever you call it, and you want to get the edges to where they're not sharp. Okay, just a little bit, because you don't want to run any burred edges through your bending process. So you want to take all the edges down to where basically you have a smooth nib. And this one's pretty good. There's no hard edges. So next, we're going to get our shape. We're back at the jeweler's press, and one of the biggest changes that I have made in the creation of my nibs has been this particular jigs or tooling setup. Prior to this setup, I was using jeweler's swage blocks, and they're basically blocks that have the concave made into them, and that you take dowels and you've seen jewelers, and you hammer to the shape. The problem with that is that sometimes you can mar your material, you can dent it, you can crack it, and it just doesn't sometimes come out right. I spent a lot of time trying to sand them, and a lot of times it wasn't very good. So I reached out again to Bonnie Doon Tools, and he created me this. This basically works with rods, metal rods that are in basically the same diameter that you need. Now, they don't come out perfect, but they come out darn close. And these sit in a U channel with magnets, and you can get different sizes. And it sits atop your jeweler's press, and then using a block of urethane rubber, you set your nib blank, and let me see if I can get you closer in to see that nib blank. You can see that right there. And that nib blank sits evenly straight along the lines of that. And you can gauge it as you're starting to press this. You can see where you're at the closer you get. And I can make adjustments. And I think I'm good right now. And then you can start pressing it all the way through. And you want to press it pretty good. And this urethane rubber will bounce right back. And you can use it several times. And then you undo it. You want to grab your nib. And you can see the results are amazing. That was just a couple of seconds, and I was able to press it into that shape. Now I'll do it again with a smaller diameter rod and get even more of a curvature that I need. All right, here we go on our second press. And it's a little bit smaller diameter rod, and what I'm trying to get is just even more of a curve. And this won't take very long. Okay, we've got it to the apex. We'll bring it back down. Let's see what we got. And as you can see, that's almost to where we need to be. It is done beautifully, even, smooth. You see no marring of your metal. Great job. Back at the nib making bench, and this is the swage block that I used to use, and you've seen it in the previous video. And I still do use it, but I use it only to make sure that I've got an even, so I just tap it a couple times throughout the nib to make sure that it is concentrically round. And it is. I don't beat the crap out of it, and I don't mar it, but I want to make sure that everything is completely rounded and is done evenly. And this one looks like it has. The next step is to get the shape or the taper of the nib where you want it to be. And using these metal steel tapering nib blocks, which you can buy from pentooling.com. He's an amazing guy, and I buy a lot of my tooling from him. I'm trying to give as much shout out to the people that have really helped me. This guy sells a lot of great tools. He sells burnishers. He sells these blocks. He sells them in thicker. He sells them in this size. I have them in both sizes, and I actually have a couple of them. And I have my marks here where I want to set my nibs to where I know that this is where I start my burnishing. And basically what you're doing is you're burnishing to form the nib. So I lay it down, and I have this area right here, and you can see it's a little high if we look. So next, I take my specialized burnisher, and I go in here and I push down and I burnish. It doesn't take a lot of force because these nibs aren't very thick. And I start to burnish this nib to form to this channel. And you'll start seeing your nib taking the shape. And the next thing that I do to make sure that I'm getting my right position is I use a dummy feed. And I see that I'm getting close, but I want to get a little tighter around that arc. So I'll continue doing that. Okay, you see that we're really right there. It fits nicely. It's flat. We have it centered. We're not one side to the next. The other thing you could do is, if you want to make sure that your nib is, you put it on here and you see that doesn't move side to side, so you know that you've got it evenly bent and it's symmetrical. So the next thing that I do is, using a series of sanding pads, I start to sand the back end. Now, I did that thinning when I first started it, but I know that it's not thin enough. And also what I want to do is I kind of want to round over my edges. The reason for that is I don't want any sharp edges to cut into the sides of my housing. So I want to kind of roll over the sharp edges here. I don't want any sharp edges. But I want to start even continuing that taper. And then what I do is, as I'm doing it, I use my feed and I check. Now I don't force it, and I see that it's not ready to go in there yet. So I'm going to have to continue some sanding, and this could take a few minutes. As you can see here, we are getting closer and closer. This is tedious, but it's important because you want a nice snug fit, but you do not want to crack your housing. You do not want to break your feed nipple. And you will do that because what you do is when you put too much force or pressure on one side or the other, it puts parts out of alignment. And these parts were specially made to align. So basically, you just want a nice curvature and you don't force it. It'll let you know when it's ready to go in there. The next thing I do is once I get it kind of snug and I'm getting close, I'll go from the underside. This also, what happens is I'm smoothing out my metal, and I'll go from the underside and I'll just start sanding back towards the end of the nib. This also gives me that taper that I'm looking for. And I sand in all directions, getting everything evenly. I don't sand all the way to the top because I don't want to take that. And you can see how I've got my taper kind of towards the center here of the nib. And I'm doing the same thing back here. All right, so I think we're pretty close. We've got our feed in there. It's lined up. We just need to press. Not too hard. There's going to be some more sanding, but we've got a good fit. We can unscrew it. It's not choking it. It's not marring it. It's not, and it's not in any danger of cracking. And we've got a good, tight fit. Now, I realize it's a primitive way of doing it, but it actually works. It's worked for me. None of my nibs leak. Sometimes they will, but once you heat set, you should get a really good flow without any leaks. All right, I'm going to leave it here. This is going to be the end of part 1. And in part 2, we're going to start tipping, and we're going to tip this by using a micro arc welder. All right, stay tuned.